let's begin. We're dealing with Longinus' work on the Sublime today. And in the syllabus I had it last class rather than this class, but it's better that it fell out the way it did in the end, because On the Sublime is very different from the standard works of the classical period. And in fact, this work written by Longinus, or attributed to Longinus, seems little recognized in the ancient world, has little influence at all, in fact. And so, and it generally agree that the author wrote in the 1st century and attributed to Longinus, Cassius Longinus. But whatever his name and whatever his origin, it's clear that the author is a teacher of rhetoric or of some sort. And this essay has something of the same sort of tone that we saw with Horace, directed to a pupil. So there's a sort of a familiarity or intimacy of tone there. And so that's noteworthy about this. But as I say, this is not an influential work in the period, and it doesn't really represent a classical, definitive classical view either. So why are we dealing within this period? It's simply that's when it was written. However, the reason it's on the course is because it becomes very significant in the Renaissance period, when the text is rediscovered, as it were. Then it takes on not only some significance, the theme or the subject of the Sublime becomes very important in the 18th century and all important in the 19th century. And so here we're dealing with a very odd aspect of scholarship. When you're studying texts, it's funny how they at times have no influence in their own day and yet take on, are lauded in ages to follow. Like William Blake, even, in my romantics class we talked about Blake being basically ignored in his own day, and yet a century and a half later regarded as one of the 6 great romantic authors, which is an interesting act, and to some degree it substantiates the point I often make that it's problematic to study our contemporaries and regard them as worthy of serious study, because sometimes the passage of time needs to clear that out for us. What really does last and makes a long-standing impression. Sometimes it's influence on the age. It was popular then, it was regarded as great, and we can still see it. But it's often the case that things that are very fashionable and seem important at the time, a couple decades on, everyone shrugs their shoulders and say, why did anyone read this? Because it's terrible, or it's not really, it's pretty, compared to the great works that we're reading it alongside, it really ought not to be included in that company. So there is something to be said for the passage of time in terms of seeing whether something deserves to be read. But as I say, in this case, Longinus's treatise had little influence in its time, and it only became important in the Renaissance when it was rediscovered. And that's why it's on the course. And it's not only important in the Renaissance, it takes on even greater significance in the Enlightenment. And then what constitutes the Sublime, we're going to see, changes in significant ways. So I'm going to try and recapitulate to some degree what Longinus says about the Sublime, just to give you a sense of orientation for what I'm going to talk about in this lecture. What Longinus says, what are the features of it that would fit a classical age, and then I'm going to note a few things that are going to move away from Longinus in the definition of the Sublime, and what the meaning and significance of that is. So let me just explain what Longinus says, first of all. his distinction of something that is sublime or hypsos, so the Greek title of this, and it is Greek title, and I'll transliterate it, is hypsos, on the elevated or the high or the lofty, is a reference to different types of style, commonly acknowledged in the field of rhetoric. There's a high style, there's a middle style, there's a low style. There are three styles. And as I say, all rhetoricians would acknowledge this. And what Longinus does is focus on the technical aspects of the high style, and wants to attribute greatness. So what is it that makes it great? What are the features? Where can we trace them? How can we explain them? How does the artist achieve greatness there? When we come to Augustine shortly, he's also going to talk about a low style, medium style, and a high style in discussing even the works of Paul, for instance, but even in Scripture. And he's going to dispute this notion of high style as necessary for Christian teaching. In fact, he's going to talk about the lowness of style and yet the height of the content. So that's an interesting, and it's going to fit Christology insofar as the incarnation, God becoming man, is an instant of abasement, and likewise the crucifixion even more so. What is by the world's standards ugly and hideous is the most glorious, sublime act, theologically speaking. And so our assessment of what constitutes high, middle, and low is going to be reassessed come the Christian period. But we're not there yet. He's talking now about grandeur in a rhetorical sense by worldly standards. And he's going to describe how we come to, how an artist produces that. What is it that allows him to achieve this? And Longinus attributes it to something of the spirit. There's a spiritual capacity that the artist has, which is going to sound a lot like Wordsworth for those of you who just did preface to lyrical ballads with me. There's something in the artist himself which allows him to achieve the grandeur in his poetry. So very much of an emphasis on the spirit. And to some degree, I'll comment on this. This fits in with the anthropology of the period, which regards the spirit to be the essence of a person and the body to some degree as a prison for the soul. Right? So the soul is a immaterial object and greater than the body, which is the house, but often cast as a prison. And so if you're going to appeal to a high style and to grandeur, to some degree you're talking about spiritual qualities of human nature and the artist's spiritual attributes. And so naturally it's going to lean or marry itself very easily with Christian theology, where, of course, the greatest of all things, if you can call it a thing, which you ought not to, it's a category mistake, but God is the greatest. And the greatest commandment is to love. Right? Jesus asked what the greatest commandment is: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second commandment is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. It's going to connect the spiritual object of worship, God, with and your neighbor who bears the image of God, and connect it to love. So love is going to have a significant aspect of grandeur in Christian poetics, and yet that love is going to be influenced by our notion of Christ's love, which is sacrificial and very physical. And this is going to be complicated then when we come to Augustine's discussion of these things. And then love becomes the sort of the bedrock of Augustinian theology and really of Christian theology. Even if you're not from the Western tradition, I think love is a significant feature, but it's the primary feature of Augustinian theology, I think. But Longinus regards sublimity as a thing of the spirit, and he describes it being like a spark that jumps from the soul of the writer to the soul of the reader. So it's a spiritual act, like a fire, and it's easy for it to fit in the pagan view of human nature, because if you look at, let's say, Ovid in the same period, he describes us having a spark of the divinity within us. Just a spark. Not the whole, we're not divine, but there's something of that in there. So that sort of theological expression here, there's something greater than a mere animal in human nature. They will associate it, the period, less with the spirit and the spark and more with the capacity for reason. At least Christian theologians will. So Boethius, who's writing after Augustine, says that a person is an individual substance of a rational nature. More closely associated with reason. But as we've already seen with Plato and with Aristotle, but certainly with Plato very clearly, the capacity for reasoning is associated with the spirit and with something distinctively human. So it's an immaterial process distinctive to mankind among all of the creatures. But you can see that it's leaning in the direction of the non-material. And this is why when we come to Wordsworth, it's problematic to connect our human spirit with nature as in the physical world. It's a collapsing of two contraries. It's spiritualizing nature and it's materializing humanity. And the effect is not to elevate nature, but to debase mankind ultimately. That's the effect of the collapse of the distinction there. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. For him, the sublimity, as I say, is the spark that moves from the author to the reader. And he suggests that it is a matter of the greatness of spirit above all. There is a technique to it. There's a technical aspect to it. But ultimately, it's a reflection of the greatness of the author himself. You can't produce sublimity if you don't have greatness in you. And Wordsworth will agree on this, with him on this. So one of the interesting aspects of this course is reading authors and comparing them and seeing where they have points of agreement and disagreement. But Longinus is quite clear. He says, sublimity is the echo of greatness of spirit. And so because it's of the soul, it might pervade a whole work. So if it's a speech by Pericles, the whole speech might be filled with grandeur and a reflection of the great man who articulates the speech. It might be the case. Or even history. If the author is great enough, Herodotus or Thucydides, the whole history might be so filled with the grandeur of the spirit of the man who writes it in his ability to tell a history of events, which makes us think that the events are so extraordinarily important that they need to be remembered. That's a reflection on the author more than the content. Like the historical events themselves pale in significance to the telling of the story. And I think there's something in this, something which the modern historiographer loses sight of because they want fidelity to the details to be the, sort of a documentary, have to record what, Winston Churchill ate for breakfast, and how he treated the maid and what he was like in his spare time, and not dealing with the grand speeches and picking up the grandeur of the individuals. Historians will place different emphases. In our age, they often get lost in the details and move away from this important sense that Longinus captures that grandeur is really why we want to read things and why we continue to read them. So I think he's right here. So it can be the entirety of the work, or it can just be a few lines from a work. He even cites John's Gospel, interestingly, which again dates it for us. If you follow the New Testament scholars, I don't know when John is now said to have been written. It keeps moving around, but let's say 70 AD. So it's supposedly the last of the Gospels, right? In terms of when it was written down. 70, 80 AD, so then Longinus, who cites this, must be writing after that, if that's the case. So it could just be a line, which is so great that you remember it. It jumps out at you, and so when God says, "Let there be light," and there was light. Actually, he's not citing John's Gospel at all. He's citing Genesis, which is very interesting. How on earth did he come to have an awareness of Genesis? Is it through the Christians he's encountered? Is it through Jews? He does know it. He's read it. He cites it as an instance of the sublime. But what he shows then is a very keen discriminatory eye for excellence or grandeur in all manner of texts. Now, if you take this and put it alongside the classical age that I've talked about thus far, last time I talked about in the Hellenistic period how they come up with the notion of the classic. So there are epic writers that are considered classics and their works. There are tragedians, and there's a whole list of these are the classics. And in general, I think Longinus would probably say that they're capable of this grandeur. I think that would probably fit. So the sense of greatness and being considered to be classics, there's considerable overlap there. Those who are classics produce this grandeur on a regular basis. But note that when it comes to breaking down what constitutes a classic, there's more awareness of the specifics of the text that constitute a tragedy or an epic and so forth. And Longinus has no interest in genre. He's not interested in that. He's just interested in the common element in all of them, which he calls grandeur or something high or elevated or lofty. That's what he's interested in, irrespective of genre. And in fact, it even goes into scripture here then. It's not from one of the classics. I mean, Christians might think it is a classic, but it's certainly not in the list of the Hellenistic classics. So he is aware of this, and he says that the distinguishing mark of the sublimity is a certain quality of feeling. A certain quality of feeling. It's not simply that of emotion, and in fact he explicitly says it's not that. It's not simply a matter of emotion. And I maybe go into this, but it's certainly not powerful emotion. And again, Wordsworth has just defined poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. All good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. How is that sublime? It's not by Longinus' definition. The fact that it is spontaneous is irrelevant, that it's an overflow, irrelevant, power, not irrelevant, but not definitive, because he again says that it's not just emotion, but it's a particular type of emotion. It's one that we will attribute nobility or truth to it. That's the type of feeling that he's interested in. Those which are stating particularly true things or particularly noble things. And this sounds a bit more like a Christian definition. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is lovely, Paul says, right? Think about these things. Right? That's more of a Christian aesthetic right there within Paul's understanding that will help us when we talk about literature even outside of the Bible. How do we assess culture? Well, we're going to use something like Longinus' definition of it. Whatever's true, whatever's noble. That's what I mean by sublime. And powerful emotion may be actually not noble. It may be ignoble. It may be disgusting. It's certainly going to move us, but it'll move us in a way that Longinus will think that we ought to abhor. And he's not interested in that. He's not interested in low. He's only interested in high. And the low style, like comedy, is not going to gain his approval. It's not that he has no interest in comedy, but that's not when he talks about the sublime. He is not talking about something that moves us to laughter. It's something that moves us to rejoice and to praise. So again, it's elevated, it's noble. We look upon it and we admire it. We look up, we don't look down. Comedy makes us look down. Comic characters in take a Shakespearean play are from the lower classes, the common people. Think of Midsummer Night's Dream, Bottom and his company of actors. They're the commoners. They make body humor jokes, which might be funny, Dumb and Dumber type stuff, but they're not something that is ever going to be considered lofty or grand, even if it will move us for some reason. Even to tears, it's not enough. It's so just the powerful emotion, not good enough. And he says that only art can guard against the exaggerated or misplaced feeling. Now, so art, there's a place for art then in directing us towards the sublime. Whereas Wordsworth rejects art and appeals to nature. He sets a explicit contrast between the two. He wants to avoid the neoclassical criterion of decorum, which is the marriage of teaching and delighting. He wants to jettison that. Whereas Longinus is really fitting in with what we saw last time when Horace talked about decorum, which is to say, to teach and to delight. That's what decorum is to fit that sense of delight. And delight, then, in the sense of it renders noble something. It makes us admire it. And art ought to be directing us to be better than we are, not worse. And it can do both. One of the great harms done by modern egalitarian politics is to render as equal the ugly and the beautiful. They're both powerful. One may be bad, one may, but to say, well, but they're still emotionally valid, as if emotion were the adjudicator of nobility or excellence. So many artists will now seek to shock their audiences and will regard it, oh, that was great, like a Quentin Tarantino film, where it's just gratuitous violence there to shock, and that's considered, well, it's powerful, oh yes, and it shocked me, it made me laugh, it moved me, whatever. There's no doubt about that. The question is that good art then? And by the classical understanding, it absolutely is not. In fact, it's so strongly held in the classical era that in the tragedy, the actor wears a mask. You do not see the face of the actor, because it was debasing in some ways to look upon that. They believed that you, by looking at people's faces in agony, we were being degraded somehow. Not because the experience was degrading, but because it was making us think about our bodies and not about the spiritual significance of the situation. And so Odysseus, when he cries, he pulls up a veil to cover his face. It's not because he's a man and men don't cry. That's not the issue. They're happy to cry. That's not the issue. It's that there's a sense that he ought to be fighting against his body, elevating himself.
Yes. Would the actors and the have just worn the same mask for the whole.
Yes, play didn't change, or the mask didn't change. So that then what you would have in the mask is something of the character of the essential character of the whoever they were playing represented in the mask. I don't think there's a great deal of artistic license there, because you could paint something of the features on it. I don't think there's a great deal done there. It's more or less the voice and the language that's going to give rise to the character rather than the face of the person. And I say this because we now very strongly are influenced by the visual media because of films, TV. But even because of the Renaissance, and I'll get to that in a second, because again, this idea of the sublime takes on huge significance come the Renaissance, when the work is rediscovered. And suddenly they talk about the sublime all the time. And it grows in significance. So art is there to guard against misplaced or exaggerated feeling. And it does so for an ethical reason. It's to teach us what is good and noble and to guard us against that. So it's not just make us feel overwhelmed with pity or titillated in like pornography. And it's to guard us. Art is there to move you so that you feel the experience and yet don't overindulge in it. If you want good illustrations of this in poetics, look at Ben Jonson's little poems on the loss of his son and his daughter. It's very restrained and powerful for it, very restrained. And yet the restraint, you can feel the restraint. You can see that he's holding himself in, and you can see that his heart's broken, and that it's the restraint that makes you here's a noble man trying to contain himself, and that affects us far more than somebody who's just screaming and wailing and who's lost the length of the line is irrelevant at that point, and it's just stream of consciousness. It's just overflowing with emotion, reflecting Wordsworthian poetics there, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling without any guidelines to it. So art is there, but it has to be said, for Longinus, the art, the techne, plays second fiddle to genius in producing the sublime. So if we're going to talk about nature or art, Longinus privileges nature, if you want to use that term. But he would probably prefer genius. We could talk about that. But it's a gift that the artist has almost by birthright. It's something that's not taught. It's an attribute of the person who may be sitting in the same classroom as everyone else and just is more naturally gifted. It's easy to spot athletically, physically. Like we can just, that kid's faster, that's more graceful, whatever. We can see that. In terms of writing and thinking, it's a little less obvious. Again, in schools we promote literacy. Everyone is supposed to reach a standard level of literacy, and schools are measured by what their literacy rates are. But that's got nothing to do with creating excellence. Literacy is not excellence. It's just basic, low-level competence. And competence is a good thing. It's not to be disparaged. However, it's not creating grandeur. It's not creating the people that are going to be culturally significant. And again, it's the product of our egalitarian democratic age. And it, to some degree, goes against the very spirit of higher education. But he says that, so the nature of the person, their aptitudes, their genius, has 5 sources, and they're listed here on the screen, here behind me. if you want to write them down. And how they're related to passion, well, you can look at that yourself. This is just listing them. He lists 5, and 2 of them are related to what we would call nature, and 3 are related to art. And they are listed in order of significance. So the first source of the sublime is grandeur of thought. And he gives illustrations of this. Grandeur of thought. And it can be broken down in various ways as the natural outcome of nobility of soul, as the ability to choose the most striking circumstances. So you just have a way of, with words, to capture that moment. It's in photography, you can do it as well. Everyone can take a photograph. You have a cell phone. Everyone's got their phone up. What's the difference between a good photograph and a normal photograph? It's not the resolution. That's what the tech companies selling you cell phones say. You know, the brilliant colors, look at all the... That's not what makes a great photo. The great photo is capturing the moment, which represents something there that is not just there if you film the whole thing. If you film the whole thing, you would have that moment, but it would not be distinguished from all the foregoing and succeeding moments. You've captured one moment for everyone else, and that will represent that. And so there, you can think of famous photographs which we associate with periods because there's a grandeur about this, or it's something that's memorable. But grandeur of thought there, choice of the most striking, so that involves the grandeur of thought on behalf of whom? The poet. The poet is able to choose the most striking circumstance to illustrate something very important. Or amplification, and here he compares Plato with Demosthenes, the great Greek orator, the greatest of the Greek orators, rhetoricians. And then he compares Demosthenes with Cicero, so he's comparing Greek and Roman authors here. But they're capable of amplifying subjects so that grandeur is exuded to the audience. And they look at what are the particular features. He's not interested here in minutiae. He's the general impression. Then he'll talk about imitation, which Aristotle says is the mark of poetry in general. But here he makes it a feature of grandeur of thought. And then finally, use of imagery. Secondly, the power of moving the passions. So these are sources of sublimity. Power of moving the passions. He just skips over it. Then he moves on to figures of speech, different types of speech. But rather than go through these in specific, the 5 sources are going to be under the title of great thoughts, grandeur of thought, noble feelings, that's number 2, power of moving the passion, so noble feelings he talks about. And then the final 3 are related to lofty figures. When I say it's not just figures of speech, but lofty figures of speech that make our minds, uplift our minds. There are certain types that do this. There are many figures of speech, but not all will cause our minds to be lifted up. So here's a use of words. Fourthly, diction, graceful expression, he calls it. Note that it's not just words and ordering, but graceful. How well you said that. It's just right. What a wonderful way of putting that. And so those little wonderful ways of articulating something, those often get passed on into the language, and we lose the source of it even. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. Okay, it's a rhyme. It could be applied all over the place, but you could think of Penelope deceiving the suitors. but you can do all sorts of things, the ruinous effect of lying and so forth. It's memorable, often contained in little phrases like that. And finally, the dignity and elevation of structure, or just the arrangement. But note again, it tends towards elevation and dignity. So it's always upward pointing. But the first two are matters of the greatness of the spirit. Grandeur of thought, nobility of feeling. Those are natural, or you would say God-given. We say God-given. You can train and train and train. You can get the best teaching. You cannot put in what God has left out. Those two, grandeur of thought and nobility of feeling, they just seem to go with the person. And everyone else can just resent them for it, or they can admire them for it. And if they live in a noble age, they'll admire them for it. And if they live in a resentful, egalitarian age, they'll hate them for it. Oh, I hate how talented that person is. It makes me envious. And you want to bring him down. That's characteristic of our age. We really despise greatness. We seek to crush it, don't want it anywhere. It's so much a part of the psyche that people will be self-deprecating at all times, lest they incite the envy of somebody around them. It's very difficult, because from a Christian vantage point, we don't want pride, but we do want excellence. How do you discourage pride and encourage excellence? And excellence is something that should be seen and something that should be celebrated, while at the same time dealing with the terrible problem of pride. Corrosive, the deadliest of the deadly sins. Superbia in Latin. But this is about the superb. And we want to avoid pride. And yet pride is in attaining excellence. And you may have a natural capacity for grand thoughts, and you have a noble breast that is capable of these sentiments. And is this prideful to be given these attributes? Well, you could, out of a false sense of Christian humility, suggest that you're just the same as everyone else. I think that would be a tragedy. Not in the Greek sense, but in a human sense. That's very difficult. I've noticed it throughout my life in public schools and even in universities that people whom God has given great gifts are discouraged from expressing them. There has to be a way of doing that without creating a prideful person. And I think the best way to do it is simply to reflect on Christ, whose majesty is evident in his humility. So there is something to be said for the grandeur, and this is now a Christianizing of what Longinus is saying, the grandeur of humility. Again, so Christ is the template here. Longinus is saying nothing like that, of course. He doesn't have Christ as his model here. And again, the gospel is foolishness to the Greeks for this very reason. Forgiving your enemies, this is the Christian ethic, would never occur to any great Greek. To forgive your enemies is contemptible. That's what Nietzsche would say. It's a slave ethic. That's how Nietzsche describes it in the 19th century. It's a Sklavenethik. He would have us achieve greatness in the untrammeled sense of Longinus. Go after the sublime without any sense of a need to restrain. Comments or questions so far? I'm not going to go into all the specifics here, but as I say, even when he talks about the 5 sources of the sublime and talks about great thoughts and noble feelings, they're all, and the figures of speech are all those which are elevating us, and graceful expression and the dignity of the structure. And he even talks about the modulation of the syllables, the way that we speak them. It sounds grand. He's right. So he's picking up on something. This is very, very helpful, I think. And what are the vices of style destructive to this? Well, abuse of rhythm, broken and jerky clauses, undue prolixity, you just go on and on and on and on. Improper use of familiar words, anti-climax, etc. These are the sorts of things you get criticized in your essays with. Run-on sentences, broken syntax, incomplete sentence, whatever. You can't achieve. You can't be a good writer if you can't avoid these vices of style. And then he gets into the very interesting topic, why this age is so barren of great authors, whether the cause is to be sought in a despotic form of government. Interesting like that. So the power is all at the top and it pressures it. It won't allow greatness to rise up. The same sort of comment that he speculates on here has been speculated on for our age as well. It's not that we are living in a despotic age, but rather in a democratic age, which is motivated by egalitarianism. And it flattens everything. In the name of it, we all have to be the same. Flattens all distinctions. Or is it because of politics, or as Longinus thinks, in the prevailing corruption of manners? And that is the Christian take. It's less to do with the forms of government and more to do with the general state of morality. And so when Christians try to address the lack of grandeur and beauty and nobility in their age, they do it through ethics and not through politics. The Marxists do it through politics. Christians do it through ethics. And ethics begin with me. Politics begin with government at the top. Ultimately, an ethical transformation of character and manners is going to affect government. But it's Christians that'll say we get the government we deserve. So why are our political leaders so embarrassing? Because we're embarrassing. And we elected them. And they represent us. In a sense, they are the mirror. So we can disparage a politician, but maybe we want to have a look at ourselves, how he got to be in the position he's in. How do we not see this? And how are we allowing it to continue? And then how would we prevent that from happening again? Well, by cultivating a grandeur of thought and a nobility of spirit in ourselves and in our children, so that they would elect individuals that would express the same thing. They would want it everywhere. And that's the way you address it. But again, the Marxist is going to do through politics from the top down. Longinus is more in keeping with the Christian tradition and the classical tradition, for that matter. He's probably, if he really got into this, though, he would suggest that it's the cause may not be in political forms, but political forms have some influence. But they're not going to just lean towards democracy as a solution. Plato was concerned about the effect of democracy on crushing nobleness of spirit and elevation of thought. That was his critique. He wanted his culture to be better. Anyway, no questions, let me move on. So the reception of the text, though, in later antiquity and in the Middle Ages, for that matter, this treatise is totally unknown. As far as I know, there are no references to it. Horace, Ars Poetica, all over the place. Virgil, etc. Great Roman authors, yes, but Cassius Longinus is not mentioned at all. But in the Renaissance, it was published in Italy by Robertelli in 1554. Now, without getting into this too much because it's out of context, the Renaissance we associate with the rebirth of classical learning. And although there is poetry written in the period, what's new to the poetry in the period is the courtly love lyric, which is debased and involves an adulterous relationship. At the cent, it's being lauded as the example of love. Now take that. Love is the expression of Christian ethics, but here we don't have love, we have lust, and we have illicit lust at that. It's a man of lower station seducing an aristocratic woman, effectively. Think of Guinevere and King Arthur, the whole... so there's that feature of the Renaissance. There is an interest in poetry, for sure, but the portrait of manners tends to be anti-Christian in its sentiments. It is talking about love, but often love is perverted. It's not. I'm not saying it, all of it, but that arises in this period. It's not disparaged. And what does flourish is the plastic arts, like statues and painting. Very much we associate with the Renaissance to this day. But as I said to you, in the actual classical period, statues and paintings were not revered as particularly noble or grand. They had them, particularly the statues, because those were the examples that were used by the great Renaissance sculptors and so forth. But it's clear from classical texts that there's no regard for these as expressions of greatness or sublimity. And you can see that they're capturing it when you look at the statues. You say, "Oh wow, that's just terrific." And they're trying to capture sublimity, but they are not highly regarded in the classical period. In the Renaissance, on the other hand, painting gets elevated through the roof. The very visual, the physical, the thing you can see. And you could still say that it reflects grandeur because, in a sense, the typical Renaissance portrait has a sort of a triangle in it, and there's a sense of the elevation of, like, say, the Virgin Mary holding the bambino, the little baby, the Christ child, has a sense of the nobility of the noble woman who Mary is always portrayed as, Madonna, my lady, holding on to the child, and there's a nobility of of God Himself being nurtured by a woman. There's a curious tension there. It's not just a picture, but even the way it's portrayed there. But still, that's the period when this first is published and translated into Latin in 1572, and in English, and this is where it'll be important for us, I guess, in 1652 by John Hall, translated in English for the first time. So mid-17th century, now 1652, this is published. It would be known in Latin before this by Milton, but it's first published in English in 1652. In other words, during the middle of the English, under Cromwell's government, in the Republican period. First published in English. Having said that, it has no particularly strong English influence in English thought until later on. And where does it get praised for being so important? It's in the neoclassicism of the French Academy, the Académie Française. A writer whom we will look at in a few weeks by the name of Boileau. I'm jumping ahead a bit here. We're going to look at Boileau. the great French neoclassical critic. And some would say, and I'm of this mind, in the process of elevating On the Sublime destroys classicism. He's the high priest of neoclassicism in the French Academy, is Boileau. But he elevates this particular treatise as having such importance, and I think you could argue, and I will argue, that the Sublime under Boileau destroys the whole classical ethos, but not for reasons I blame Boileau. It's for different reasons. We'll get into that as the course progresses. The Sublime becomes very influential in English writing. There are countless treatises in the 18th century comparing the Sublime to the beautiful. So there's no discussion here in Longinus, although I'll say a little bit about that. But in the 18th century, there's a consistent comparison of the Sublime and the beautiful, over and over and over. The beautiful is like this, but the Sublime is like that. In Longinus, it's clear that the beautiful or the Sublime is the most beautiful thing. Right? It's elevated. That's parahypsos. It's on the elevated. It's an elevated form of beauty, but not only of beauty. It's an elevated form of something great, and that's not only beauty, but in the 18th century, it is only related to beauty. It's not elevated nobility, which it would be in Longinus, or elevated justice. Something grand and noble. In the 18th century, when the English start discussing it, it's related to aesthetic, and it's a visual. It's related more to the Renaissance's emphasis on visual things. Not exclusively, but I would say that's the general thrust. To the point where a whole new branch of philosophy emerges which did not exist in the ancient world: aesthetics, as a separate philosophical branch. Immanuel Kant dedicates his most important critique, at least from his vantage, the critique of the power of judgment, the third critique, to aesthetics. Following the critic by the name of Baumgartner, he's the one who first uses the word aesthetics. And aesthetics is from the Greek verb to perceive. And perceive in English thinking is more of an epistemological category. What are the empirical? What are the empirical qualities which allow us to perceive beauty? And they're going to reduce those to sensory and wholly jettison the idea of morality in the process. And so in the 18th century, we get the beginning of a gulf that has never been breached since that day, a departure of beauty from goodness, which is not there in the classical world, it's not there in the Christian world, but it does appear in the 18th century. Beauty and goodness part paths, because aesthetics deals with beauty and ethics deals with goodness, and they're separate branches, and there's no overlap even. And so the unity of beauty, truth, and goodness, which is a part of God's own character in Christian thinking, is exploded in the 18th century. As I say, it never comes back. And to get the emphasis on aesthetics to the exclusion of ethics, reaches its sort of zenith in the writing of the late 19th century art for art's sake movement in France and then later in England. Aestheticism, which I think has done the greatest disservice to the appreciation of literature. 20th century literature suffers from a lack of substance as a result of this. We no longer get the great works that have grandeur of thought and nobility of feeling being put before us to admire and to emulate. It's not that authors are incapable of grandeur of thought or nobility of feeling, but they don't see it as their goal. Maybe they lack the character if it's from nature, but they're from the cultural vantage point, there is no desire to encourage grandeur of thought and nobility of character. It's not the aim of the educational system. And the works of literature certainly don't reflect it. You get all sorts of very debased themes in modern literature. Trite at best, but sometimes absolutely degrading, dehumanizing, disgusting. Perverse, but often it's just trivial and silly, pathetic. Now, what I'm arguing on this course is that to some degree this is conceptually driven by how we regard what good art is and what art is supposed to do. If it's just there to elevate nature and to exalt powerful feelings, then we're going to get art culture. I'm not sure if we've reached the rock bottom yet, but we're not far off it, where somebody's expression of their selves, their identity needs to be praised by everybody because they say that it's the essence of themselves and they really feel that way. It's who they are. And so we should read it in classrooms to make sure that we're not marginalizing that. So that's the outcome of false emphasis. I'm going to blame pretty unfairly Mr. Wordsworth and the Romantics on that. Now, I don't think they're necessarily wholly to blame, but there is a decisive shift there away from the mimetic approach of art that reigns from the classical period till then and what comes after it. So to use M.H. Abrams, the title of his book, The Mirror and the Lamp, we move away from the mirror towards the lamp. But it's not quite as simplistic as he puts it. I think the emphasis here from a neoclassical artistic or a classical artistic emphasis on mimesis, tending towards grandeur and classics and the way in which art ennobles us as the aim of all good art, because all good art achieves decorum, it teaches and delights, and it will move us towards instead the poetics of self-expression and of nature without making any distinction between high, medium, and low styles. Note that Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads promotes effectively what historically would be called the low style, and the low subject matter as well. And it's not even low, it's the object that's not even considered in ancient poetry, namely the natural world itself, is elevated to importance. You get nothing like that in the ancient world. We want to distinguish ourselves from the natural world. We don't want to subsume ourselves in it as if we are being ennobled by this collapse between the human and the material world. Comments or questions? Say something. Comment here. I'm done with this for here. I think I've said enough. Anything I add will subtract from it because I think I've articulated it reasonably. Yes.
Would you say this has a clear? Well, the clear effect of this seems to be the removal of meter and any adherence to formal principles in poetry.
It does eventually. It's not in Wordsworth, right? In the Romantics, they're writing blank verse. They're using meter, and they're following Miltonic speech, more or less. Milton's their role model here, and Shakespeare to some degree, who also uses iambic pentameter. They in general use iambs because it's more natural to the English diction. It's easier to produce iambs for whatever reason. Just English speech works that way, and so it sounds like somebody's just talking, and yet the meter and the following of the meter, it's unobtrusive. It's a little bit like an English garden. It's not carefully manicured and clearly done, and like different plants are growing into each other. So it looks like it just grew up that way, and yet we can see that it's very carefully cultivated. But the hand of the artist or the gardener is not evident in the garden. Right? Whereas if you think about a classical garden, which you find in Italy or France or the whole Mediterranean world, that you put it. Here's the ideal. In those countries, they put trees in pots, flower pots. They don't plant them in the ground. You take them out of the ground. You put them in a big pot and you let the tree grow there. It's reflecting a relationship of art and nature there. It's an ideal. That ideal is a classical ideal, I would submit to you. Putting a tree inside of a pot, or big, is sort of expressing how nature is restrained by art. It's articulating it. You may think it looks a little silly. Why wouldn't you just let it grow in the ground? Because again, it's expressing a certain attitude of the right application of art to nature. Whereas the English gardens are expressing also a reflection of the right application of art to nature, and that is not just to let the nature run wild. That's the wilderness. It's to manicure it in such a way that it is restrained, but it doesn't look so self-consciously restrained. That's a matter of style and taste. And Shakespeare will become the model for this for English. This is why Shakespeare, to some degree, gets elevated to the position of greatness, is he doesn't seem to follow the rules. And yet he does follow the rules. He just doesn't look like he is. And so that there's an element of the freedom of the spirit that's expressed in this, which may reflect Protestant ethics as well. I don't know. But you could make a case for it being an expression of more than simply style. It might have a religious source, and that's a really interesting study to try and compare different Christian traditions in how their literature reflects the distinctiveness of their theological emphases. But that was a ramble. But yes, ultimately, it tends towards the loss of all ordering. And meter is a form of ordering. If you don't have meter, you don't have poetry. Poetry, Coleridge says at any rate, that's at the end of the day, that's what distinguishes poetry from prose. That's it. All these other things, stylistic figures and so forth, you can find those in prose as well. Even things like figures of adjuration, rhetorical questions, a syndeton, hyperbaton, etc., paraphrases. You can use these in narrative, in prose. But what distinguishes verse or poetry is meter. You can add rhyme as well, but rhyme's not necessary. Poetry often has rhyme, but it doesn't have to have rhyme. It does have to have meter. Come the 20th century, meter drops out and almost gets ignored. And it only comes back in pop music, in pop lyrics. and then it gets heavily syncopated in rap music and so forth, like heavily syncopated, like big, heavy beat, super regular, right? And they're overemphasizing it, like a drum beat. And so then it returns a sense of heavy artistry. And it just combines it usually with fairly mundane and certainly not noble feelings. There's a lot of art, but now it's coupled with, is it noble sentiment or ignoble sentiment? Well, it's usually ignoble, just like pop music is. But that tendency to, as you say, in terms of formal poetry, to get rid of meter, yeah, it comes back. There are pushbacks on it within the artistic community, but in terms of the dominant styles, there is no dominant style, which is itself an expression of the chaos of the age. And chaotic ages cannot achieve greatness. Or if they do, then you are a lonely figure holding your face against the storm, blowing. As I say, we don't have a lot of, we try and crush greatness. Deliberately misunderstand it. I would say doctrinally misunderstand it. We don't like that. We've got to teach that out of you. Yes?
This could also have relation to the fact that the way poetry is contemporarily conceived is that it's simply my own musings about myself and about the capitulations of my own thoughts or feelings. And so the subjects of poetry no longer have to do with matters of philosophy or tradition or theology or anything of word.
It's almost we almost always, when we think of poetry, when I speak to undergrads first year and I refer to poetry, they almost immediately think lyric poetry. And that is poetry is lyric poetry. It's a like short little music, and think that's not poetry. That's one style of poetry, and it's not the most important one by any means, and it never was. And that doesn't mean that it's insignificant, but it ought not to be the most significant, and it certainly should not be your immediate association of what poetry is, because most people want grandeur of thought and nobility of expression. They're not going to find that in lyric poetry, and so they're not going to want to read poetry, and they're not going to want to study literature. But then if you expose them to a tradition which has many other forms of poetry and writing in which there is grandeur and there are things that inspire us and forms that are vehicles for that, then suddenly you can catch the bug like I did as a first-year undergrad. I had no idea that literature could actually be interesting and something that I want more of. Yeah, it's very sad, and the poetry that's read in schools, it's the worst. It's so bad. It's pathetic, often. And the teacher may teach it. The teacher might like it or not. If they like it, it's almost worse than if they don't like it. Isn't this great? No, it's not. It's really not. I teach Homer first year, and everyone, this is great. This is great stuff. Oh, wow. I had no idea. What a great story. How come I haven't heard about this before? Good question. How come I hadn't heard about it? They also don't read the Bible in schools. I'll tell you, 40 years ago, 50 years ago in Canada, the culture would have known Scripture, not just because they went to church, because it was revered as teaching important things, morals, whatever we want to say about the debasement of an understanding of the gospel and conveying morality. They at least thought it taught good behavior. You put your kids in Sunday school because they'll be better for it, is the belief. Well, there was still a belief in grandeur then, and better and worse. Now we've got rid of all that. And allegedly the Bible teaches misogyny and oppression and patriarchy and all this malarkey, said by people who can't even read. and have no grandeur of thought or nobility of character. So just the disparaging by often contemptible people. Anyway. So the rules are not going to lead you there. The art is not going to lead you there. The art, if you follow the art and you can teach art, it will lead you to mediocrity. It won't lead you to grandeur. Grandeur is something that comes from the spirit of the person, his thoughts, his feelings. But the art will direct it there. So the right combination there is of art and nature put together. You can teach art. You can model grandeur, and you do model it, and that's sort of what the classics do then. They model in the figures of the heroes somebody who possesses great thoughts and noble feelings and makes us want to be like them. And the proof positive of that is the effect of the cultures that read those works. What did they end up being like? I would say the same thing of scripture then, and even more so. What is a culture like where people regularly read the Bible and believe that it will convey to them God's ways that will transform their societies? It will have an enormous, quiet, revolutionary effect. So maybe the reason that the culture is falling apart is people aren't reading their Bibles enough. Or not doing so with understanding. But again, I think we can apply this outside of that. Anyway, I think that's it for today.